He cleaned floors no one noticed, worked nights no one valued, and carried truths no one wanted to hear. To most, he was invisible, just another janitor in a towering building of power. But behind that quiet presence was a lifetime of experiences, scars of injustice, and wisdom money could never buy. One ordinary evening, standing before a billionaire CEO, he revealed something that would shake the room and change everything. What could man's society overlook, possibly know that the powerful had missed all along? He was a man most people passed by without a second glance. The kind of person who blended into the background of towering offices and polished hallways. His name was Thomas, a janitor in one of the wealthiest corporations in the city. Every evening, as executives rushed to their cars and high-rise apartments, Thomas stayed behind, mopping floors, emptying bins, making sure the Empire glass and steel looked spotless for the morning. To the outside world, he was just another worker, invisible in the shadows of power. But those who looked closer, few ever did, would have seen something deeper. The quiet strength in his posture, the years of hardship etched into his face, the resilience of a man who had endured far more than his uniform revealed. For Thomas, life was about survival and dignity. He had grown up in a world that didn't offer many chances to men like him, where hard work often went unnoticed and respect was a currency he was rarely afforded. Yet, he carried himself with pride, believing that every task, no matter how small, had meaning. Night after night, Thomas polished floors that billionaires walked across, floors that gleamed under the weight of wealth and power. But as he scrubbed away stains, he couldn't ignore the deeper marks left by a society that often dismissed him, not because of his work, but because of the color of his skin. What Thomas didn't know was that one evening, his path would cross directly with the most powerful man in the building. And in that moment, the lines between invisibility and influence, silence and truth, would blur in a way no one could have predicted. The building was quiet that evening, the kind of silence that only came after the rush of executives had faded. For Thomas, this was the time he felt most at peace. The hum of vacuum cleaners, the soft swish of his mop across polished marble, the empty offices stacked with papers worth millions. It was his world, one that no one else paid attention to. But that night felt different. As he pushed his cart down the long corridor leading to the executive floor, he noticed a glow of light seeping from under the CEO's office door. It wasn't unusual for a man at the top to stay late, but what was unusual was a sound, a sharp, frustrated voice echoing from within. Word of anger, curses flung at invisible enemies. Thomas paused for just a second, then reminded himself it wasn't his place. He turned away, heading toward the elevators. Still, the moment lingered. He had cleaned that office countless times, seen the gleaming desk where billion-dollar deals were made, the leather chairs where powerful men sat, making decisions that rippled across lives like his. To him, that office was a symbol of privilege, of power, of a world that had never welcomed people like him inside. As he finished his shift, Thomas gathered his supplies, ready to leave. But in the lobby, everything shifted. 2 security guards stood near the exit, arms crossed, their eyes locked on him. Thomas slowed his steps. He had passed these men countless times before, exchanged polite nods. Tonight, their stares were different, hard, suspicious, unblinking. "Where are you headed?" one of them asked, even though his uniform and badge made it obvious. "Just finishing up," Thomas said calmly, lifting his mop handle slightly as if to prove his point. But the guards didn't move aside. Instead, they exchanged glances. One of them muttered something under his breath. Something sharp, dismissive, a word Thomas had heard too many times in his life. His chest tightened. He wanted to ignore it, but the sting was familiar. "Let me see your bag," the taller guard demanded. Thomas frowned. "It's just cleaning supplies." "Open it," the guard pressed, his tone dripping with authority, as if daring him to resist. With steady hands, Thomas unzipped the bag. Out spilled rags, a spray bottle, and gloves. Nothing more. But the guards weren't satisfied. They stepped closer, circling him like he was a suspect in his own workplace. The humiliation was sharp, burning inside him. This wasn't a request. It was an accusation. They didn't see an employee who had given years of quiet service. They saw a man with skin they didn't trust, a presence they felt didn't belong in the marble lobby of wealth. Thomas swallowed his pride, zipped up his bag, and walked past them. But inside, the anger grew. He had done nothing wrong. And yet once again, he was reminded that to them, he was guilty until proven innocent. The next morning, the whispers began, a rumor spreading through the building like wildfire that something had gone missing from the CEO's office. Files, or money, or maybe both. No one seemed to know the details, but they all seemed to agree on one thing. Suspicion pointed toward the janitor. Thomas heard it in the way people avoided his eyes, in the way conversations fell silent when he walked into a room. A lifetime of being overlooked had turned into something worse, being seen only as a threat. By the end of the week, Thomas was called into a small conference room. The CEO sat at the head of the table, flanked by suited executives. The same security guards leaned against the wall, arms folded. The air was thick with tension. Papers were spread across the table, photographs, logs of who entered the building that night. All eyes were on him. "We're reviewing a very serious matter," the CEO said slowly, his voice measured but heavy. "Something valuable has gone missing. And according to records, you were the last person on this floor." Thomas's heart pounded. He explained the truth, his routine, his bag checked at the exit. Nothing unusual. But his words seemed to vanish into the air, unheard, dismissed before they landed. Every gaze in that room carried judgment, as though his innocence was irrelevant. His skin, his uniform, his silence. They had already written his guilt for him. The humiliation cut deep. He had worked tirelessly for years, invisible yet dependable, and now his very integrity was under attack. But beneath the fear, something else began to stir inside him, a quiet, burning resolve. He knew the truth. He knew his worth. And he knew this was bigger than a missing item in an office. This was the weight of a system designed to question men like him, to silence them, to keep them in their place. The room grew colder as the CEO leaned forward. "So tell us, Thomas, if you claim you know nothing, then why were you near my office that night?" Thomas felt every eye on him, waiting for him to stumble, to break, to admit to something he hadn't done. His chest tightened, but he stood taller. This was the moment that would change everything. Because Thomas did know something. Something far greater than what they suspected. And he was about to speak a truth that no amount of money or power could silence. The conference room was suffocating. Every eye remained fixed on Thomas, as if the walls themselves had been built to accuse him. The billionaire CEO leaned back in his leather chair, polished shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his expression sharp and unforgiving. To him, Thomas wasn't a man with years of honest work behind him. He was a suspect, a shadow standing where shadows weren't supposed to exist. Thomas's throat tightened, but he forced himself to breathe. He had been in rooms like this before, not with billionaires, but with authority figures who never gave him the benefit of the doubt. Teachers who assumed he was trouble before he spoke. Store clerks who watched him like a thief when he carried nothing but his wallet. Officers who pulled him over not for speeding, but for the color of his skin behind the wheel. Each memory clawed its way back now, pressing against his chest. The CEO's voice broke the silence. "You were the last one near my office. That cannot be ignored." The words cut through Thomas, not because of their logic, but because of what they implied, that his presence alone was evidence. He wanted to scream, to demand proof, but years of living in a world quick to punish men like him reminded him that anger could be his downfall. Still, something inside him stirred. A quiet fire, building higher with every accusation. He had spent his whole life being careful, being silent, being invisible. But now, invisibility had turned into a weapon used against him. He straightened, his voice steady though his heart raced. "You're looking in the wrong place." The room shifted. Executives exchanged glances. The security guard smirked, waiting for him to crumble. But Thomas didn't falter. He explained what he had seen that night. The light under the CEO's door, the angry voice, the hurried phone calls. He hadn't stolen anything, but he had witnessed something. Something no one else dared to mention. The CEO's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you think you know?" Thomas's palms grew damp, but he pressed on. He spoke of patterns. Files disappearing when the company faced scrutiny, documents erased before regulators arrived. Secrets swept away under the guise of lost records. He hadn't pieced it all together until that moment, but now the truth spilled out. "This isn't about me," Thomas said, his voice rising. "This is about you, about the way you hide behind power, assuming no one notices. But I noticed. Every night, I cleaned the messes you thought no one could see." The air thickened. For the first time, the CEO's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. The executives looked unsettled, whispering among themselves. The security guard stepped forward, as if intimidation could silence Thomas. But it was too late. The words had been spoken. The truth, long buried, was now exposed. Still, Thomas knew the danger. Speaking up had always been risky. He wasn't powerful, he wasn't wealthy, and he didn't have the luxury of protection. All he had was his voice. And in that room, even that felt like a fragile weapon. The CEO stood, his towering frame casting a shadow across the table. His eyes locked on Thomas, cold and sharp. "Do you really think anyone will believe you? You're nothing more than a janitor, a man who scrubs floors. Your word against mine." The words landed like a blow, heavy and cruel. But Thomas didn't flinch, because beneath the weight of those words was the very truth he had carried his whole life. The truth of how society measured worth, how racism disguised itself as authority, how dignity was stripped away with a single sentence. He met the CEO's gaze, unshaken. "Maybe I'm just a janitor, but I know the truth, and truth has a way of outlasting power." The room went silent. The CEO's face hardened. The guard stepped closer, and Thomas realized he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In that moment, the stakes had never been higher. He wasn't just fighting for his innocence anymore. He was fighting for his very existence, for the right to be seen, to be heard, to matter. And as the tension reached its breaking point, one question hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Would the truth finally break through the walls of power, or would it be buried along with him? The meeting ended not with justice, but with silence. Thomas walked out of that conference room knowing he had spoken the truth, and also knowing how dangerous truth could be when spoken by someone society refused to see. The CEO never admitted anything, never raised his voice, never lost his polished composure. Instead, he did what men in power often do. He dismissed. He brushed Thomas aside, treating his words as noise rather than revelation. The rumors lingered for a time, but the company never found its missing files. The executives carried on. The CEO kept his empire intact, and the guards returned to watching Thomas like a hawk. Life inside that glass tower didn't change overnight, but Thomas did. Something had shifted within him. For years, he had moved like a shadow, careful not to disturb the world that so often excluded him. He had swallowed slights, ignored whispers, endured the quiet but constant weight of being judged before being known. But standing in that room, facing the CEO, he realized something powerful. Invisibility wasn't safety, it was a prison. And speaking truth, even when ignored, was a kind of freedom. He still mopped those floors, still emptied those bins, but he no longer carried shame. Instead, he carried pride, not in the work, though he did it well, but in the courage it took to speak when everything told him to stay silent, because in that moment, he proved to himself that his voice mattered, even if the powerful pretended not to hear it. The truth didn't disappear. It lived inside him, and it echoed in the minds of those who had heard it, whether they admitted it or not. Some executives couldn't shake the image of the janitor standing tall, refusing to bend. Some guards replayed the conversation in their heads, realizing the strength it took for a man with nothing to confront a man with everything. And the CEO, though he would never say it aloud, was rattled. The impact stretched beyond that night. Thomas's story is a reflection of countless others, men and women who are questioned, doubted, and dismissed simply because of the color of their skin. It's a story about how racism doesn't always scream in the open. Sometimes it whispers in suspicions, in glances, in locked doors and hushed rooms. It's about how power is protected by silence, and how breaking that silence comes with a cost. But it's also a story about courage. about how a man with no wealth, no authority, and no platform still managed to shake the ground beneath a billionaire's feet. Because the truth, once spoken, can't be undone. It lingers, it spreads, it forces reflection, and sometimes it plants the very seeds of change. As viewers, we're left with the question, how many more Thomases must there be before society listens? How many more voices must be silenced, dismissed, or ignored before we acknowledge the reality of what's happening all around us? Thomas's story doesn't end in triumph or disaster. It ends with a choice, his choice to stand, to speak, to refuse invisibility. And that choice is one each of us carries. Will we remain silent, blending into the background, hoping the weight of injustice passes us by? Or will we find the courage to speak, even when the room grows cold and the odds are against us? Because the truth is this, racism survives in silence. And silence, too often, is the loudest voice in the room. So ask yourself, when a moment comes, when you see injustice unfolding before you, will you look away? Or will you stand like Thomas and speak the truth that cannot be ignored?